Hi, we are at week 12 now, and this is our last week of content. This week's topic is really a culmination for us of a semester of learning about theories, frameworks, history, and approaches to doing work. And now we can talk this week about how that applies in community health research and policy frameworks. So this brings us back to questions and conversations about why we may need different approaches for different communities and populations. So there's a lot of conversations and certainly very differing opinions about community engagement, like how much engagement is too much or too little, what is ethical community engagement, how do we navigate the different kinds of power dynamics that might happen, what are the different contexts that they occur in, and why do we do it in the first place? So we've also had a lot of different conversations this term about criticalities, and I want to take a moment and talk about the different ways that we use the word critical and how we engage with critical dialogues. So on the one hand, when we talk about engaging critically with, like, for example, the course content, this might mean taking what we've learned about health promotion, population health, social dimensions of health, and asking ourselves, how does this work in practice? Like, does it make sense for the people that I work with? Do I agree with it? And this is the critical thinking piece. That sort of constant reflection and evaluation. But there's a distinction then between thinking critically or being critical and criticizing. And we want to be adding something of value to the conversation, right? I think I talked about this in my beginning video. So altogether though, when we think about things this way, criticalities are distinct in their own because there's such a thing as this critical paradigm and critical theory. And that is actually something very specific because it asks how and why we critique and think the ways that we do. And a main focus of critical theory is how certain forms or styles of words used to communicate, how they've been normalized. So ultimately, by knowing how ways of communication have been used to oppress, we can then look for ways to foster positive change. And I like using Dr. Judith Butler as an example. And here there's a quote that she says, critical doesn't mean being destructive, but only willing to examine what we sometimes presuppose in our ways of thinking and that which gets in the way of making the world a more livable place. And she's a gender theorist, and she works primarily to seek ways to undo normative categories that are prescribed to people. And she has this one example that I like. I find it's pretty accessible, and I call it like her say yes to the dress example. And so, for example, somebody presents a young lady with a dress to wear. And what is this young lady saying yes to? Is she saying yes to the dress? Or is she saying yes to what the dress represents in terms of how she should look and behave or live out her life? So gender theory is, just one offshoot of critical theory, and there are many, like post-structuralism, post-colonialism, feminism, indigenous feminism. Some of you during class have, brought up some of these things in the way that you center your practice in them too. But really altogether, what these are asking of us is questioning, why are things the way that they are? And usually, why are these things in place that seem to dictate our places in society? So there's many ways and many areas of inquiry, exploring text, media, labor relations, politics, and these are all places where we might see socially constructed inequities influence people's lives. And in this course, we have begun to explore some of the areas and the ways that normative social structures and categories are present in the healthcare system and how we negotiate health within our lives and how and why, for example, COVID-19 is influencing different communities and on those different and multiple coin sides in complex ways. So now we've had a pretty steady diet of how health is discussed from different perspectives as policymakers, like with consideration for population health agendas, healthcare providers they have responsibilities of capacity building and care, and then from other perspectives like being the care recipients and recipients that receive care in culturally informed and trauma informed ways. Why is that important? But now if we connect this with criticalities, the question for me is then, how is the way that we talk about health, how does that change our conversations? And in thinking about ways that we can change our conversations that might reinforce power dynamics or work to dismantle them, then we think about, think for example, in our final example or our final assignment, why it's so important to consider who it is we're talking to, what form of knowledge sharing that we're using, and why we've decided to use that one in particular. So I'd like to do an exercise here, and here's a photo of an emergency waiting room. So now just imagine that you walk into the emergency room as a patient. You're walking into this. So how are you going to move about this space? What questions are you asking yourself when you go in here? Is there a bit of fear? Like there's a lot of people here. Are you confident? Have you been here before? Maybe you're really tall and you can see very far over. For me, I'm quite short. And so, things look different from my perspective. So maybe you have a different level of ease though, because you're familiar with emergency rooms and what they look like. So all of these things, what dictates how you move about this space? Okay, so next, what if you walk in here as a nurse? How are your actions going to be different because of the position that you're embodying going into that space? How do other people see you? Do they engage with you? Do they talk to you? Okay, now what if you walk in as a doctor? Now how do people treat you? How do you treat them? What do they expect of you? Do they talk to you? Why are there all of these different dynamics? And why is this important? Even the way that I present this, patient, nurse, doctor, what do you think of that order? What if I go the other way? Doctor, nurse, patient. How does that change the conversation? Did I imply a hierarchy when I did that? Okay, so now granted, it's not an uncommon criticism of critical theory that this kind of questioning or thinking, can start to muddy the waters a lot because you might start to lose sight of the big picture. But maybe it is the big picture, because it's in this muddiness that we begin to make sense of why we might do things the way that we do. And it's also important to think a lot of the community-based research canon, it has grounding in critical discourse. And that's because to be effective in engaging with community-based work, we have to recognize the different positionalities and our positions as people coming into that community. What is our relationship to that community? Okay, so now on being in relation, because I think sometimes, we hear this self in relation, and what does that mean? So being in relation or relationality, it means, and this is my version of what it means, I am who I am because of who you are. I'm a TA. I occupy that identity of a teaching assistant because of who all of you are. I'm a daughter, but I'm only a daughter because of my relationship to my parents, and my mother, who is Connie from week 8, by the way, for those of you who didn't know. My mom, Connie, she's a mother because of my brother and I. Our position in those relationships can't exist without others. And so that's how we are in relation. And so when we talk about community-based research in ourselves in relation, what is our relationship? Maybe we're community members, maybe we're daughters of those communities, maybe we are brothers, maybe we are physicians in those communities. And those are very important things to bring in and establish what are those dynamics there. Certainly with the relationship between my mother and I, there's definitely a hierarchy there. So how is that addressed then when we need to get work done? Okay, so now with that in mind, one of our readings this week is Sean Wilson's What is an Indigenous Research Methodology? Because Indigenous research methodologies are all about relational frameworks and they flow from relational ontologies. But Sean Wilson, he has such a magnificent way of explaining relationality, and he explains it at this worldview level And he does it by placing an Indigenous paradigm in relation to other paradigms in theoretical frameworks. And that gives us an idea about how things can work together. And the other reading here, sort of on this vein, is this article by Sarah DeLu, Margot Greenwood, and Emily Cameron. And this takes a much more critical look at relational engagement and specifically community-based research. And it asks us to reflect on what we're bringing into those spaces of engagement and how we're going to be accountable to those relationships that we develop. Okay, so to our readings now. One of our other readings, it's another editorial by Dr. Hancock. And in this one, now he talks about, okay, advocacy. It's not a dirty word, it's a duty. It's a duty. So he talks about this. He talks about this role that we have as public health professionals to act in a role, or rather to have an active role in advocacy. And specifically because we have the ability, the knowledge, and perhaps the influence to move public health agendas forward, especially those that are addressing power structures that maintain social inequities. And I use this graphic to sort of like insert advocacy between health and harms, because that's sort of the messaging that I got from the work, is that he's saying you have that ability maybe to be that barrier and be that protective messaging, that protective sort of conceptual piece between the two. So there are arguments against this, though, this approach that you are an advocate, activist, you know, that those roles may be synonymous with being an academic. He presents some of these, and if we also think back to the interview with Dr. Hayes, he presents some other reasons maybe against this too, for and against this. And you know, some of the things like what happens when there is that institutional separation from the public sphere. You know, is that remove some bias that is an important thing to maintain in certain types of conversations. So that's just a bit of food for thought. So you know, what do you think? So then our other reading here. So these readings, there's not as many this week, and they're quite a lot shorter. So hopefully this gives that time to engage deeply with them where you need. Moving on from some of these more theoretical or conceptual frameworks, I always like this chapter as a bit of a case study. And this focuses on some of the findings from the Visioning Health research study. And Visioning Health supports Indigenous women who are living with HIV. So for a little bit of background then, HIV policies and programs, they are largely grounded in biomedical models, and those are underpinned by Eurocentric values and structures. And this project specifically was advocating for the deconstruction of these policies by applying an Indigenous intersectionality-based policy analysis framework. And that framework there would center the voices of HIV positive women and also Indigenous notions of health. So really making space for those patient voices. And what they found, and you'll read more about this in the chapter, is that culture and gender were implicated in all of the health enabling strategies that were identified in the research, and that they were able through this to provide some very specific recommendations to ways that you could decolonize policy and practice specific to living with HIV. So similar to the other week, we've got 3 choices for questions. And the first one's going to ask you about your experience with community-based work and how it may be aligned with some of the principles of practice that you'll read about this week. And for the second question here, you're going to hear this week too in one of the media videos from a colleague of mine, Claudette Cardinal, and she's a community-based research associate. And she talks about some of her living experience as a peer navigator, as somebody living positive with HIV who has found her voice through research. And I'm asking you to respond to some of the things that you've learned about her lived experience that you may not have considered before. And then finally, based on what you've learned in some of this talk here, our readings, and then overall throughout the course, how using a critical perspective might bring together all the different kinds of research and unite them in that common goal of having healthy populations. All right, and so everyone, This is my last video to you for this class. A really big thank you to you all for showing up and bringing yourselves and your personal touches. Here are some of mine. There's Connie again. We're in Vietnam. This was several years ago. And best of luck for you guys on the final assignment for the rest of term. And I look forward to hearing from you all again soon. Take good care.